Does it
Yes,
work?
thank you, Jared.
Okay,
I'm here, and thank you to the tech support for
great.
setting this all up. You guys can let me know if I can go ahead if you've got everything ready. Is that okay?
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And even though I couldn't make it to Dublin today, I apologize for that. As you can see by the hotel art behind me, I'm stuck in Paris. But I appreciate being a part of this conference. And if it's okay with all of you, we're going to switch gears a little bit. And not just because I'm not Irish, nor British, nor even European, but because when I asked the organizers what I should address today, they suggested that I reflect on the changing landscape of research ethics throughout my career. Now, to be honest with you, I wasn't aware until that point that I was old enough to give those types of talks that reflected on my whole career. But now that I know, I guess I've been thinking about it. And I know that I have been around for a while, and I've met several challenges along the way. And I'm going to share a few stories about those challenges with you today. And my principal thesis of the stories is that we've come a long way in how to define and guard and promote ethical norms. But the challenges of today, I think, are in how we concretely implement these ethical norms in an evolving landscape that brings unforeseen conflict and unfamiliar contexts. And so when making the right decision is not a technical matter, and it's not resolvable by additional evidence, but where value judgments are needed about whose norms and which values take precedent. So with that, I'm going to take you back to the turn of the century or thereabouts, and my first research job. So I was working on thalassemia. Thalassemia is a genetic blood disorder that causes the production of abnormal hemoglobin and results in a very severe anemia across patients. And treatment for thalassemia includes monthly blood transfusions to replace the faulty blood cells, and also a daily iron chelator to remove the excess iron that builds up because of all these transfusions. My new job was in the prestigious and linked hospital and university institutions of Toronto, which had the largest thalassemia clinic in North America and an exceptional research program to match. And as a new research coordinator, I attended the training provided by the hospitals, which was quite a bit like what Deirdre presented this morning. So I took in all their videos about the risks and our imperative to protect patients. And I learned about the horrors of the Nazi experimentation in World War II camps and the syphilis experiments that happened in Tuskegee. And I came to understand that research was putting our patients at risk and that research participants were vulnerable. And they were vulnerable because they were ill. They were vulnerable because they needed treatment. There was stigma associated with their illness. They needed the interventions that we were going to provide, but they had to go through all of these procedures. They might have a limited ability to understand the research, but they had all of these issues that I had to be now in charge of protecting. But that was okay because I had good training. And the training reassured me that there were safeguards in place to mitigate these risks. Like there was consent so the patient could choose and make their own decisions. There were reimbursements and other benefits to make sure that patients could benefit from research. Data and privacy would, of course, protect confidentiality and make sure that nothing bad would happen to them. And we had a research ethics board that would make sure that our research was well designed and carefully implemented. And most important, we had institutional oversight of all of this. The hospital and university had layers and layers of oversight to ensure that the patient's interests were prioritized. And so I walked away from this reassured that the horror stories from my training were from before I was born, and that I could step into my new role with the confidence that the institutions would uphold the values that ensured that we all did what was best for our patients. And so with that, I started my new job and my new boss, who was an amazing hematologist named Nancy Oliveri. She was the director of the hemoglobinopathy program, and she had a large research portfolio that at the time included clinical trials of a novel oral iron chelator for thalassemia that was licensed by a Canadian generic drug giant named Apotex. So a couple of years into one of these trials, and this was in the late 90s, Nancy reviewed the trial data that was coming back and identified a loss of efficacy in the drug. This led to dangerous increases of iron in some of the participants, which could be fatal. Nancy immediately informed the ethics committee and Apotex of this finding, and she prepared a revision to the informed consent form that would tell patients about this finding and enable them to reconsider whether they wanted to continue their participation in the trial in light of this new evidence. So the ethics committee agreed to this revised consent form, but Apotex did not. And Apotex immediately stopped the trial, removing access to that drug for all of the participants, and Apotex enforced the confidentiality clause that was in the contract that Nancy had signed with the company that forbade her from disclosing the findings to anyone, including the patients, for 12 months after trial completion. So what did Nancy do? She informed all of the participants and the regulators and the community of clinicians who were testing or prescribing the drugs, and she published her findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, on the sidelines of this trial, Apotex was nearing completion of arrangements with the university and the hospital for one of the largest donations in institutional history to fund one of the university's new biomedical research institutes. On publication of the trial results, Apotex promptly suspended discussion on that donation. And the hospital responded by relieving Nancy of her role as program director. And she was vilified by a series of administrators and institutional leaders. Apotex then sued Nancy for breach of contract in the tens of millions of dollars. And the saga that followed, which I don't have time to get into today, but was full of hate mail and lies and corruption and high-level manipulation, so shocking that it's worthy of an airport paperback or a Netflix series. Now, if you would like to read the full story, it's available in many formats, but I'd recommend the report by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is available free online. But for those of you who prefer a lighter read, Nancy's story was a major influence on John le Carré's Constant Gardener, and he spent many hours interviewing her in preparation for the book. And I wasn't kidding about the Netflix series, it's under production. But back to Nancy and the patients. Those patients whose illness and health literacy and vulnerability I was so worried about, they rallied immediately around Nancy. They protected her as she had protected them. And they stood up for themselves and they fought back against very powerful actors. And I came to understand them as a force for their own rights and the rights of patients and researchers across the globe, and for the values that the institution had failed to get right. The institutions clearly, to me, had other value that they were prioritizing, and they lacked mechanisms and will, quite frankly, to protect researchers and patients from commercial interests, failing in their value judgment. So I, in my own mind, and I think we as a research community, have moved away from this paternalistic vision that research participants are primarily defined by their vulnerability and their need to be protected. And we've moved to a more egalitarian perspective that research participants and their communities should be considered and treated as co-creators of the research that they are involved with. And so it was with this mentality that I moved on to my next position, but not after a short break. I took a few years and I had a few kids. And by the time I was back, the research regulators, governors, and approvers had developed new tools to improve research quality and oversight. But in lieu of strengthening mechanisms to make value judgments, instead they took a more checklist sort of approach to make sure that researchers followed processes that were designed to uphold the values. And these checklists were handy for training new staff, which was very useful to me in my role as the head of the clinical trials unit for the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. The problems I encountered there usually had to do with the fact that the community was not very good at following the checklists. For example, GCP demands that an ethics committee has an independent member. But that does not fit well with the culture of committees in Vietnam. And we had a requirement that the informed consent form must state that the project is a research study. But that doesn't translate very well to Vietnamese, where the only word available for research is nghiên cứu, which means experiment and brings up sort of ideas of guinea pigs and harm. But having that requirement contradicted what the patients were telling us that they thought should be on that consent form. And ensuring free choice of participation in a patriarchal medical system where doctors' opinions are revered and patients would never consider getting an opinion was a challenge. And then one time, our UK-based ethics committee reviewed our informed consent form for a tuberculosis study, and they disputed the use of the word dam, which accurately translates in English to sputum on the form that they were reviewing. And they said that sputum was not a lay term and therefore was not suitable for our forms. But of course, in Vietnam, unfortunately, sputum is a very common term that everybody knows the meaning of. So on another note, we adapted our studies to include the outcome of palliative discharge in lieu of death, because patients and their families didn't want to die in the hospital and preferred to be discharged shortly before death and often not contacted afterwards was their preference. And then there was a time when a very senior member of the Ministry of Health staff asked me why we were wasting so much time doing research on HIV patients. And in each of these cases, we had to negotiate the conflicting interests and values of very different parties. But nowhere was my perception of the misalignment between international research regulations and local practices more intense than when, in 2015, I was a part of a team delivering clinical trials to find treatments for Ebola during the West African outbreak. And the requirements of industry and international sponsors for the contents of an informed consent form did not align with the needs of these individuals who were very ill, very frightened, had little trust of government or definitely not foreigners. They spoke a range of local dialects, they had different healthcare traditions, and they were a part of a population with some of the lowest literacy rates on the planet. Now, Andrew highlighted this issue even in Irish patients, but can you imagine how this is amplified in a West African context of having to fill out or get through and complete a very long informed consent form? I want to share one experience with you about that time running Ebola trials that is not research specific, but I think is a good indicator of this difference of cultures. And that's that before I went out, I got very good training on infection control and personal protective equipment and how to don and doff and all of those things. And core to that training was don't touch anything. I was not a part of the clinical care team. We were there to do research. We walk in, walk out, we keep our hands at our chests, and we don't touch things. So my very first time going into the red zone, I was accompanied by a doctor from MSF, or Médecins Sans Frontières, and this was in Gekidju, Guinea. And so we put on all of our protective gear and we walked into the suspect tent. And the only suspected patient in the tent that day was a 5-year-old baby. Now, both of this baby's parents had already died of Ebola, and the baby was now febrile. And the MSF clinician with me immediately noticed that the baby needed milk and needed something to drink. And so she handed me the child and said, "Could you please change him?" and walked off to get milk. And so contrary to all of my training, but my maternal instincts clicked in. Of course, I changed the baby and I rocked him and sang to him as I waited for that doctor to come back with his drink. And my colleagues were horrified when they heard about this as I exited, but also understood that maybe all the preparation and the checklists that were given didn't always apply. And I reflected on this afterwards as all of these lessons learned and associated recommendations were issued after the epidemic. And they largely focused on technical innovations and things that we should change. And what they overlooked, I think, was the essential role of normative innovations, like the importance of fostering multiple levels of trust and building fair governance and cultivating broad research collaborations. So now I work in the Pandemic Sciences Institute at the University of Oxford, and we focus on outbreaks. And during the COVID pandemic, my boss, Peter Horby, ran the recovery trial. That trial recruited more than 48,000 patients and provided much of the life-saving evidence on effective and ineffective treatments during the pandemic. And the success of that trial was a result of alignment of values and actions across funders, industry, regulators, public, academics, and all of the stakeholders involved. But unfortunately, this was not the case in the next public health emergency of international concern, which was Mpox. So in the spring of 2022, an epidemic of Mpox spread across the UK, Europe, and many other regions. And the vast majority of patients were men who had sex with men. And very quickly, the UK National Institute of Health Research launched a call for funding of a clinical trial to test effective therapies. And the requirement was that the application be made within 72 hours of the call going out, and that the trial was started within 2 weeks. Now, we'd named the trial Platinum because it was the Platinum Jubilee weekend that weekend. And not mine, but many people's weekends were spent writing up that protocol and ensuring that we could respond as quickly to this health emergency as we had to the COVID pandemic. And we reached out right away to get input on trial design from the communities. We created a community advisory panel, and we found a lot of people with great experience in patient advocacy from whom we learned a ton. And as this epidemic spread across the region, we engaged thoroughly with the community advisory panel, and they helped us to reach out to HIV groups and LGBTQ charities and communities and get tons of input. This is on the trial design and the informed consent forms, on our ethics application, on the advocacy that we did, and on communication, even with the clinical units, which they knew better than us because they knew where people went to get treatment. And the networks that we created with their help was something that we would never have been able to achieve. And the fairs where we presented, and all throughout the waning of this epidemic, we were advocating for what was going to be a great clinical trial. However, contract negotiations with the funder and pharma meant that the trial did not start until 3 months later, when thankfully cases were dropping off, but it means that we never got the sample size to address the key question that we need to answer this epidemic. And now the key question from our community, who worked so hard to help build up all of the resources and get people ready for this trial, is why not? And we know that in contract negotiations, everyone has their own values and priorities. But why is it that we can overcome these differences in some situations and not others? And what does it take to ensure that all outbreaks and all people are treated equally? So Dirk mentioned struggles with timelines on centralized reviews. And of course, Peter has introduced us to CTIS. I had my own first introduction to CTIS quite recently when we were launching an observational study of Mpox across Europe. At the request of the EMA, we launched a multi-country observational study right at the start of the outbreak, and it involved 10 countries across Europe. Now, UK and Switzerland were included, but as they are not a part of Europe, they got their own approvals very rapidly and started recruitment. And we submitted to CTIS at the same time or shortly thereafter, because it's a bit more complicated. And I think, as Peter was alluding to, I think this is our study that he is mentioning. The regulators were on board very quickly. However, the ethics committees, as you can see from the trajectory, took some time to consider this. And subsequently, the other 8 countries across Europe began their studies much more slowly than the UK and Switzerland, with the exception of France, but only because France, in parallel to the CTIS application, made an application for an observational study to their local board outside of CTIS, gained approval, and started the approval using that mechanism. So I don't know if this analogy is going to land well, but I'm going to try it anyways. All of these stories remind me of the challenge of finding a partner. Because many of my friends come with this checklist of what they want their partner to have. So who they should be and what they should enjoy, what type of job they should have, maybe what they should look like. But no matter how many boxes get checked on that checklist, when it comes down to it, what mattered for the success of that relationship and for it to have value, and what was really, really most important, was that their values were aligned. And research requires several diverse partnerships. And I think that we need to find ways to navigate value judgments when priorities and perspectives differ. Thank you very much.